And my apologies even later because I didn't have an HDMI cable, but luckily my good friend Kim we had a cable with her translator. So let's get started. So my name is Andrew Patricio. I'm presenting on data effectiveness. And I'll tell you a little more what that is. A bit of a story for you. Okay. So just want to talk about the introduction. What is data effectiveness? The current state of kind of data in general DCPS. Data reporting issues that we have in DCPS as well as elsewhere. What I'm terming data quality culture. This consistency, relativity, accuracy cycle, which I mentioned in the little blurb in the brochure. Our reporting platform, which is sort of our data warehouse light, and how we manage requests. Did you hear when people just read it? I could have just read that in like 5 seconds. Okay, so DCPS, led by Chancellor Kai Henderson since 2010, and actually until this year, I don't know if you've heard, she's going to be moving on at this fall. But, before that, it was Michelle Reed and Chancellor Henderson. We've pretty much had a steady increase of students. So DCPS, DC is a little bit weird. We're not really a city. We're not really a state. It used to be that DCPS was a chartering authority as well, but now there's an entity that's the state in DC, even though it's not really a state. And all the other charters are LEAs underneath that entity. So it's very much a kind of a competition now, whereas before it was sort of like a not quite. So 48,000, almost 50,000 kids, about 117 schools or so. About me, so I'm Andrew Patricio, and I am the former Deputy Chief for Data Systems because I'm actually left DCPS about 2 weeks ago. It was my last day. I was already planning on giving this presentation. They were graciously allowed me to come here and represent DCPS and the work I did there, but the point being is, so, you're in the right place. Look at those kids, they need to eat. That's what college, right? Nice to live. But what I did is, so previously I was way back when an electrical engineer. I worked in management IT consulting, and I don't even know what that is either. My mom kept asking me, what is it you do? I'm not really sure myself. But now what I'm doing, or I'm attempting to do, is this www.dataeffectiveness.com. I promise that's my last sales pitch, but keep that in mind if you really like this presentation. All right. I also got a Twitter handle too. I had no idea what Twitter was until about 2 weeks ago, and then I became a Twitter. All right, so data effectiveness. So everybody talks about big data, talks about data-driven X, Y, and Z, data-driven decision-making, data-driven instructions. Everybody wants to use data to make effective decisions on that. Question is, there's a little bit of a problem there a lot of times because if the data is wrong, then you're kind of not really making an effective decision. You may make an excellent analysis, a great conclusion, but if your data is all garbage, it sort of doesn't really matter. The reality is that data is often in poor shape. So just a quick aside, I sent out a survey. I think those of you on the CIO list, Bob sent that out to folks, got 11 responses, and so I'll be going through some of those responses throughout the presentation. This is sort of an indication of who responded, so pretty reasonable sampling. So the first thing is I asked, how is your district set up for data reporting? In DCPS, we have my team, or my former team, the data systems team, which was primarily responsible for all the reporting from this information system and kind of all the technical work, the report writers. And then we had what was called the data strategy team, which was the kind of data analysis kind of central organization, but really it was kind of spread out over all the programs. So every little program had its own data analysis kind of person. Sometimes it hired somebody, sometimes it was sort of somebody who was kind of moonlighting. But you can see here, that's pretty much the same in most of these other districts. 80% have a central reporting team and kind of distributed analytics. So like I said, data reporting team, me in the bottom, the green team. The red guys are all the data analysts, data strategy and whatnot. So data strategy was our primary consumer, but we also interacted directly with some of the other program analysts. The data strategy folks also tried to kind of clarify requests and make sure people were really getting what they intended to get and things like that. So all the complicated data pools, anything to do with kind of building tools and stuff like that, that was sort of my team. Well, data strategy folks was kind of the sort of consultants, if you will. But the thing is, DCPS is very data driven, and my team was, people were all complaining, hey, we wanted to report 2 weeks ago, where is it, and why is this number isn't matching this number? So, we were at the bottom of the hill in terms of, all the requests and everything. It was a very tough place to be in, and at the same time, I understood the frustration of people asking us because we're kind of struggling. It's like we want to be data driven, we can't do anything, we don't have any data. So So the question is, and then the other problem was that we had a varying degrees of data quality. We just replaced our Sioux information system with Flawed Aspen, which went fantastic. Flawed was a great company to work with, so I'll give them a little shout out because they really were great. But that was a new system, so going forward, our data quality was not too bad. But we had legacy data. We still were transitioning. We only transitioned fully this past year, so we had a lot of existing data. There was varying levels of data quality. It improved year by year, but we still had to deal with stuff that was kind of crazy. So the question was, how do we deal with that? And my answer is data effectiveness. So what is data effectiveness? Well, high performance data, analytics, you have a great analytics team, you put in crappy gas, you're not going to get anything, right? So the question is, you need to have a pragmatic approach to data reporting. Clean your data. The challenge isn't really using analysis, it's usually the prepping, the cleaning, the correlations. My funds are my relation, I put a graphic up there, but it essentially says that 76% of data scientists find data prep the least enjoyable task, right? And that makes sense, right? Because everyone gets into this data science world because they want to change the world with data, but then they realize, well, changing the world is literally on kind of shaky foundations, right? And so what I'm trying to address is those shaky foundations. And then the last point, I'm not sure, just actually take a step back. In this room here, how many of you guys are sort of on the data reporting side as opposed to the analysis side? Just quick raise of hands. And how many of you are kind of on the analysis side? And how many of you are sort of consumers of the analysis? Okay. The reason I was asking that is because one thing I realized, which is kind of an obvious statement if you're not a technologist, is that data analysts are not necessarily technologists. Which is to say that they're statisticians, they understand data, they understand that, but they don't necessarily understand how to get data out of the system or why it's going wrong. They assume, well, you have the system, you're tracking the data, why are your numbers wildly different? Why do I pull truancy one day, it says 90%, and I pull another day, it says 89%? Why is it always wrong? Another data point was listening to this Freakonomics podcast, and so Stephen Levitt is the economist who wrote that, and they're doing a podcast, and this is a podcast from a number of years ago, it was a repeat happened here a few months ago, but what he said was that, so it wasn't the main thing of the podcast, it was questions he was answering at the end, and someone asked him, everybody knows about this data-driven X, Y, and Z, everybody knows about how we need to make better decisions, how come we're not? And what he said was, essentially, he was amazed, and that was the word he used, he was really amazed at how much technology was involved in getting data. And in his mind, he was like, all right, we get the data, then we go do our analysis. And we're going to do all that work doing analysis, but getting the data is a huge pain in the neck. As I'm sure all of you, whether you're doing it or whether you're asking somebody to do it, you realize that. But it kind of struck me. I was like, you know what, that was a huge sea change in the way I thought about things, because I realized that, yeah, sure, somebody might know R, they might know stats, they might know math, they might even know some SQL, but that is a far cry from understanding the data systems themselves and where data goes, how it gets in, how we get bad data quality. And so again, data effectiveness is where that comes up. So what do I mean? Data effectiveness. It's getting good enough data when it's needed to who needs it. So being perfectly correct, but too late, who cares? Doesn't make a difference. And so the point is that I'm really focusing on the product of each one of these stages, right? So you have data reporting, gets the data, creates the reports, does the technical queries and all that. Their product is effective data, and with effective data analytics folks can make effective decisions. With effective decisions, the business and the program side can push towards effective outcomes. And so it really starts at effective data. If you have crappy data, you're going to get crappy outcomes because you're steering, looking at the wrong map. So current state of DCPS. So these are rough estimates in terms of the times, but 10 years ago, a decade ago or so, it's funny, like a decade ago is like a meaningful term for me now because I'm 42 and I'm still getting used to that. But anyway, so 10 years ago, we had an SIS. It was a VAX system, a mainframe, and every school was kind of on its own of how they interacted. There was no central or function with it. There was no pretty difficult to get reporting. It was very much the sort of Dilbert-esque approach of going to the temple of data and making sacrifices to the priest, and hopefully they'll get to it within the year and get back to you. And it wasn't necessarily their fault. It was just difficult to get that data out. Actually, that was pre-10 plus years ago. 10 years ago, we replaced that with a new system, which was an Oracle form. So even that was a little bit old. It was hard to customize the front end. The back end you can customize the way you wanted to. So it did a decent job of tracking things. The data quality was still an issue. Then 5 years ago, we got to the point where we're still using that system, but we were getting to the point at least where every bit of data that was critical was tracked somewhere. It wasn't necessarily tracked centrally, but at least it was captured somewhere. And so the question was, how do you correlate that and get a nice holistic view of the student's performance or whatever you're looking at? There's a lot of VLOOKUPs. VLOOKUP was the way that we ran things for a long time. And then today, where we have a much more solid system. Like I said, we replaced that old system with Aspen. But more to the point, the key thing of kind of my whole presentation here is that we create a separate reporting database. So the challenge of the transactional system, right, where it doesn't know what data you're going to have in there, so it has to be very flexible because it has to take account of any kind of option. When you're doing reporting, you know what data is in there because it's the data that's in there. You're not going to worry about any kind of guessing as to, well, are they going to do this or are they going to do that? So you have a lot more flexibility in what you're doing with that data because you have a lot more rigidity you can rely on in the database itself. So specifically, data capture a while ago, not real great. Data quality is kind of crappy. Reporting return on investment was really low. We're getting better and better. Our data quality got better 4 or 5 years ago. Still not great, but it's getting better. It's heading in the right direction. Our data capture is pretty much spot on now. The only challenge we have now is our reform is changing so much we have to kind of keep up with it, but at least we're capturing our data everywhere, so you find it somewhere. And our reporting is a lot better shape now in terms of the effort it goes to and how you get data to people. So here's an example of one of the requests we get. So this is an attendance weekly. So this goes out to the attendance folks, central office, and then they spread it out to the schools, the attendance counselors and whatnot at the school. And it really, this is just one, so you can see there's a bunch of different tabs here. Some of these are school level tabs, some of these are student level. It's an Excel file that we generate once a week and send out. And so this is like the core way the attendance folks in the central office manage the schools in terms of, hey, your attendance is improving or you're decreasing or what have you. So it summarizes weekly and yearly attendance for every student at DCPS. Standard absence stats, so in-seat attendance. Difference between in-seat attendance, I'm not sure if that's a generic term or not, but the idea is that you have unexcused absences, which kind of gets truancy. You have excused absences, which don't. And you have in-seat attendance, which means that if you have a doctor's appointment and you're not in school, you're not in your seat, and so you're not receiving instruction. Whereas, for example, if you're suspended in school, technically you're receiving instruction, so that doesn't count against your in-seat attention, whereas the doctor's appointment does. So it's the idea of getting a sense of how much time are kids spending in school, aside from unexcused absences. It also includes our interventions and behavior stats. So pretty standard report, fairly complicated. Another example is, we call our adjusted course graduation rate report. And I'm not an educator, so you probably know way more about this than I do, but I'll give you my explanation of what it is. Essentially, what it does is it tracks the 4-year cohorts across all high schools. So when a kid enters 4 years ago in 13, well, whatever it is, it kind of tracks their progress and are they making adequate progress each year. So, did this kid, for example, DCPS, in order to move from a 9th grade to a 10th grade, you have to take Algebra 1. So the kid missed Algebra 1 in 9th grade, now he's in his 2nd year. Technically, he's still a 9th grader because he hasn't gotten that credit he needs to go to the 10th grade. So that just tracks all that kind of thing. And there's also some really complicated rules that I don't understand about when a kid can be held accountable by DCPS and when he doesn't. So when a kid withdraws, depending on how they withdraw, they go in and out of this report. But the point being is fairly complicated, fairly comprehensive report. So it's all our high school students. And this is an example of some of the columns. So these on-track ones, not only are you looking at your credits, right, did you pass the total credits, but you're also looking at the courses you're enrolled in right now. So you have to look at their schedule as well. So I don't know if you've done any kind of work pulling schedule data, but that's a huge pain in the neck. That's probably our biggest bear with this sort of report. And the point being is that, so it's some kind of standard data. Did they get that credit? Did they get that credit? And also some very complicated queries to sort of figure out their current state. So data reporting issues. So how does data go wrong? Well, at DCPS at least, there's 2 big areas. One is data entry issues, the vast majority we have nowadays. The other is legacy data. So, let's start with legacy data folks. I remember, I like databases, and so, to relax, when you're in the middle of the summer, which, not for me this year, but in past years, I like to kind of go into the database and just clean up crappy records, right? So we used to have this old VAX system. When I translated the data over to the previous system we have now, which is called STARS, and now we have Aspen. So when they translate from the VAX to STARS, it didn't do a great job. So you had a lot of things where you had an admission from like 1996 that had no withdrawal. And so that kid essentially had like 2 admissions on the same day and only one of them withdrawn, so there's an imbalance. So it kind of looks like the kid's still there, even though he's not because he'd be like 30 years old. So that legacy data was kind of hanging around still, system transitions. The other kind of legacy data was like previous years, we realized, oh, wait, we got this business rule wrong, we have to change it, or hey, you know, new directive came down from the government, from the city government to change the definitions of something. So you had all this kind of old data that wasn't quite really valid right now. But again, the main thing was this data entry issue, because the legacy data, once you kind of saw that once, it's not changing, so you kind of, that's a diminishing problem. Data entry issues, though, are a big problem, because people make mistakes, you know? I meant to withdraw that kid, but I withdraw these other kids. Or, hey, you know, I got 5 parents standing in front of me to register their kids. Let me just get through this real quick, and I'll just put in, instead of putting in a new enrollment record, let me just change the enrollment date for the old record. And, you know, the system doesn't care because it's just transactional. The kid is enrolled, don't care if he was enrolled yesterday or he was enrolled 5 years ago. He still, last action was being enrolled. And so there's all these workarounds that they do because they don't understand necessarily the long-term effect of that. Another thing is poor understanding of the policy, right? When this kid comes in with this situation, I need to respond with this code, but I didn't do that. And now it's jacking up our data, and so you have to go back and change that. And then duplication, you know, especially for our early childhood kids, because in DCPS you have you know, early childhood is part of the public school system. And so a lot of times what happens is a kid comes in for early childhood, and they want to evaluate for special ed services. And so if he's 3 years old, he's not actually coming in until August, but they need to enroll him right now today just to evaluate him, because the way our integration works, he has to be in the SIS in order to get to the special ed system. And so what happens is that special ed system kind of admission just starts hanging around. It never goes away. And then they admit him for real in the fall, and now suddenly you have 2 admissions, so you have 2 duplicate students. It happens less so with a kid who's been here for a while because they usually know him and he has records, but especially for new kids, a lot of times to get that duplication. Another example, so this is that enrollment thing. So we pulled our 13-14 overall absence rate. We pulled it in July at the end of the year, right? We got, these are made up numbers, but we got like 95% of this, right? We pulled the same data in October, so just after the summer. Suddenly we're at 92, like, what's going on? You can't have absences in this. I mean, they don't count against next year, and the system is rolled over, so people aren't entering in absences. What's going on? How are you entering in absences in the 14-15 school year for the previous school year? And then we thought, well, maybe we screwed something up. Maybe it was a bug. Turns out that the reason behind this error was that the schools are going in, and this is my point about the workaround, and they're doing that. They're doing exactly what I described. They're saying, all right, this kid is an enrollment record of admitted in August of 2013, right? For whatever reason, I'm just going to change that to August of 2014. So now he's, from a data perspective, he's disappeared from a school year. And they're doing it systematically enough that essentially all these kids were disappearing. We had absences around, and it was just kind of jacking up our data, which is crazy. So, you know, that's an example of how the unintended consequences. Here's another good example. So, you might, I don't know if you've heard of this thing, but this is sort of a dashboard that we put together. My team worked on it, but also the data and strategy team was the primary driver of it. The idea is that with all this data, we want to get to the school, so let's create this little dashboard. You know, it was custom built by us, and it has JavaScript on the front end, and you know, just a regular MySQL database in the back end, blah blah. But the problem was the technology applies, it was fine. Garbage in and garbage out, right? So you'd have a report like the attendance week. They're looking at it, they're saying, my attendance here says X, Y, and Z. It says, you know, I have 5 truant kids. I look on this thing and it says I have 6. You know, what's going on? And because of the way we're doing the pulls, right, you have some subtle difference where if your data is perfect, you're going to get the same number. But your data quality, depending on the way you're doing the pull, affects it in different ways. So in this thing, it said 6 absences, maybe because it was a duplicate kid, he was in there twice, and so you're counting his absences and his truancy twice, maybe. Whereas the other report, because of the way you're doing the joins, you only counted it once. You have something like that. But people are just saying, this thing is wrong, right? Because all they know is I'm looking at one report says one thing, another report says another thing, so something must be wrong. And you know, I'm not sophisticated enough to understand all this technology behind it. In fact, I don't care because I'm trying to teach my kids. So all I'm going to say is I'm not going to trust that report because it's wrong. Another good example is, so in the SIS, you have a school directly associated with the student on the table, and you have the enrollment history, and a lot of times they didn't match. So the last admit was to a school that's different than what the SIS thinks the kid is at. Maybe because they deleted some records or whatever. So this is another survey result from that survey I put out. So the idea was, I set out these, whatever it is, 8, 10, 11, whatever it is, different, you know, is this happening at your school? And here's the responses. So the vast majority, not vast, but the majority were the requirements. So business rules that they're getting, there's a lot back and forth. They're like, well, you asked me for this, but you really meant that, but you should have told me that, that kind of back and forth. Solid data, so you have a whole bunch of different systems all over the place, and hopefully you have some kind of common ID between them all, but not always. Validity, so that's the data entry problem. Capacity, I know that we had a big issue with that. Just a sheer number of requests coming in and when they wanted it. It was kind of like, before I started working at a school district, I remember I got this job at DCPS, I'm like, oh great, I'll have my summers off, right? No. You do not have your summers off. You just nip that one in the butt. I'm just, you guys all know that already, but yeah, man, that was a big disappointment. I was thinking, oh yeah, I'll go travel and whatnot. And then, I won't go through all these, but the idea is that these are kind of very common kind of issues that we all go through. So the question is, how do we make our data more effective given all these challenges, right? How do we do the work today to improve data in the long term, but also to fight the fires to make the data-driven decisions today? We can't wait to say, all right, we're going to get our data perfect, and then you can start doing data-driven decisions. You'll never do that, right? You'll be in 2032 before you can even start making these decisions. So how do we deal with that reality? So part of how we deal with it is a data quality culture. And what I mean by that is, again, why are the data entry issues? The legacy issues, once you fix those, they're fixed, they're not changing, so that's good. The ongoing issues of data entry problem. And the problem with it, so there's two kind of very knee-jerk responses to that, right? One is like, well, if they're putting in wrong data, prevent them from putting in wrong data, right? Well, easier said than done, because if it's something like, hey, you need to put in some value in the first name column, that's easy to check. Is it there or is it not, right? But for something like, are you entering in an absence that's after their enrollment period, after they're withdrawn? That's harder to check in these systems because the front end is sort of dealing with the data entering right then. So for something like that, you kind of have to do you have to do this lookup behind the scenes to find the absences and all that, and it's a very difficult thing to do, and no SIS will do that really well. So there's a limit to how much validation you can do in the front end. The other thing, though, is that let's say there was this magic way of doing all those validations. Schools are still going to make mistakes. They're still going to want to do this workaround. And so the problem is you have to balance that flexibility as well. You can't just sort of say, it's so rigid that they can't enter any data, and if they want to change it, then to go to the tech team to answer, because that means there's more work for you guys, right? So the process we have at DCPS, when someone needs to change something, they don't have the permissions to enter a data modification request. So if we lock down the system so there's no data entry errors, then we'll be doing nothing but data modification requests all the time, right? So you got to balance out that flexibility and that kind of validation. And so how do you do that? Well, so again, this is the enrollment thing. So, and this is what I was talking about with the special ed. So, again, for enrollment, the SIS is a transactional system, right? So all it cares about from an enrollment perspective is the last action. Did you last admit the kid? Did you last withdraw the kid? The enrollment history, which we use for reporting, is really just a log, right? So you could say admit the kid, withdraw him, admit him again, and just delete those last two admits and withdrawals. It doesn't really care, because it's like, all the last thing I know you did is admit it. And so from an operational day-by-day perspective, it's right. From a data perspective, it's all jacked. So in this case, for example, maybe what could have happened, I don't really know, is they admitted the kid in the early stages. That's the special ed evaluation thing. They withdrew him. Maybe they withdrew him correctly. Or, most likely what would have happened is they admitted the kid. They admitted the kid in a different school under a different ID because they duplicated the records. Then later on, they discovered that and we merged the records. But now there's two different entries for the same kid. So the question is, well, where is this kid? I mean, we logically know that because this one has a registration date, hey, he's probably West. But that's a hard thing to code in a query, right? Like a human being can kind of make sense of this, but a computer, we talk about 49,000 kids, it's very hard to do that. So here's the key. How do you prevent those errors? And the answer is kind of, you don't really prevent them. What we try to do at DCPS is, you have this view of like, they're the users, and you're the technical team. Especially in IT, this is very prevalent. Well, I would argue that my team, the data systems team, and whatever team is in charge of the student information system, right, is in a unique position with relation to the schools than any other central office position, any other central office group. Every group in central office is supporting the schools, is working with them, helping to educate kids. The difference between the data systems team and the other groups is that we're not really supporting the users. They are our data entry team. Right? We could build the most fantastic system in the world, but if our data entry team, our schools, for whatever reason, they hate the system, they hate me, it's too difficult, they're scared, whatever, they don't know what to do, or they're scared about it, or whatever, change management aspect, then you're going to get crappy data. But if you think of it as a data entry team, like they may not be sitting there, but if they are part and parcel of your team, then it really kind of fosters that collaboration. So we tried to do like focus groups. When we implemented Aspen, we had we actually had school-based staff in the demos and as part of the validation team. And another good example is so our old system stars was kind of crappy, and so schools would buy their own SIS that they would just use internally to their school. And so they were like, well, we're entering data into ours, and we're also entering data into stars, it's like a pain in the neck. Is there any way we can do some kind of integration one to the other? And so school asked me that, and I said, well, come in, let's talk about it. So we talked about it, and I was like, I completely understand. It's a huge pain. We can't do it because if we do it for you, then we'll do it for every other school, number one. But more to the point, we might make a mistake, and then, essentially you're marking this kid true because there's some problem in the integration where it's marking extra absences than it should be, or whatever the case may be. And so I said, no, I'm afraid we can't do that. And they're kind of sad because they're like, that sucks, we can't do that. But we really appreciate that you actually listened to us. They were so grateful we actually even heard them out, right? That they were like, I see your point. And I think that's the point, right? If you treat your users, and this is a little bit of a stereotype I recognize, but it's a stereotype with some truth. If your IT team, your technical team treats your users as like, oh God, error between brain and fingers kind of thing, right? That kind of dismissive attitude, then they're not going to feel that support. They're not going to feel that. They're not going to care about your problems, right? And so by taking that kind of view of them as a data entry team, we really were able to kind of build that bridge and make sure they kind of understood why. So two specific things, and this was a big thing actually. I did a couple presentations to some of the schools, to the registrar, to the attendance councils, where I said, look, when you guys do this thing, for example, the attendance intervention, so that's the kid hits a certain number of absences, you have a letter that goes out, or things like that. You have to enter in data to track that. And there's kind of ways they can enter in the data where they would duplicate it by accident. But from their standpoint, it's like, I'm done, I documented it. And so when I went to the schools, I was like, look, when you guys do this little thing, that report you're always bitching about? Well, that's why that has duplicates in it. That's why it's wrong, because of an action that you guys took, not necessarily because there's something wrong in the code. And they were like, oh, right, okay, that makes total sense. And our error rate went down for that particular problem. Registrar is another good example. So they were the ones that changed the enrollment date. I went and did a presentation to them, and I was like, look, when you change the enrollment date, this is how it jacks up everything else. And I kind of showed them how duplicate enrollments disappeared from last year, and one of them was like, oh yeah, I was doing that. I was wondering if it was going to mess up. And I was like, yeah, well, I did, so don't do that anymore. And but we treated them with respect. We treat them as part of the team, and they really kind of, they want to do a good job, right? They're not trying to screw up your reporting. They just don't know any better necessarily. Oh, and actually the other thing is, so we created these data error reports as well. So way back when, like 5 or 6 years ago, we used to have error reports running by these different systems. Some by the vendor, some by us, and then we get these sea of error reports, right? Someone would call and say, hey, by the way, you messed up this, messed up this, messed up this. It was a very manual process to get through it. Maybe we email it to them. Sometimes if they messed up something in the SIS, it propagated these other systems. They get 5 different error reports for the same error. It was a huge hassle. So we created this management system to sort of consolidate all that. But a key part of that thing was a how-to. So hey, you duplicated your intervention, right? You have 2 interventions, you should only have 1. Here's where you go to fix it. And we're trying to get to the point where you even had a direct link, so you could click on that and throw you over to the SIS. That wasn't, we're totally fine, but that attitude is my point, is making it easy for them to fix the errors or to deal with things is really what the takeaway is. So here's kind of like our process, so to speak. So you have errors in Aspen. They go over to this, what I call the reporting platform. Sorry. We'll refer to it the mini data warehouse. We'll go into more detail on that later. These data error reports are generated. They go to this data integrity management system, which we built internally, but we're actually moving to this certified thing. I don't want to talk too much about that, though, because we're still embryonic in that. But the point being is that data integrity management system was a thing that kind of promulgates the errors out there. They see that, and then they fix it. The other aspect is that first part about validation and whatnot, where we get the data error report. We look at it ourselves and say, you know what? It looks like this error is coming up again and again. Let's add that to the data error report, right? Another additional error pattern. Or, hey, you know what? They're making this mistake in the front end. We probably can put a validation to prevent them from doing that. So the duplicate intervention, we put a validation in there, or working with Follett to sort of prevent them from doing that. So you saw some existing ones previously, but at least you're going to do it in the future. And so this is what that thing looks like. threw it together in a tool called QuickBase, which, just a quick aside, if you think of Google spreadsheets to Excel, QuickBase is that to Access. So it's a database, but it's like a nice front end and not technically used and whatnot. But point being is that we had our SLED, which is the city longitudinal tracking system, and our data accuracy report. We said, all right, here's some errors. We flagged them from it. You see here the grade level is not recognized value, and here's what you should do to try to fix it. Right? So that's a basic concept. All right. So another thing I want to talk about is this CAR cycle, right? Consistency, accuracy, relevancy. So what I spoke about just now was kind of what our long-term vision for fixing data quality is, right? It's building the data culture. Today, though, what do we need to do? So I was really, really trying to think of a way of saying, all right, here's the CAR, data-driven, and trying to tie those two together, but I was just, it's something there, but I just couldn't figure it out. So there's a joke there somewhere. But the point being is, how do you build a trade as moving down the track, right? You have crappy data quality today, but you need to make data-driven decisions today as best as you can. How do you do that, right? How do you sort of manage that? And really, it's like I said before, data effectiveness is good enough data when people need it, or to who needs it when they need it. But what does good enough really mean, right? Good enough is good enough, but what is good enough? So my answer is this: consistency, accuracy, relevancy. The goals have accurate metrics aligned with your business goal, right? But you can't talk about accuracy if you can't agree on what the value is in the first place, right? So and we deal with this all the time, where you have one report that says your let's say your truancy is 90%, another one says 81, another says 87. Well, you can't tell what's accurate because you can't even agree what the number is, right? So the first thing you do is try to make that consistent as possible, and really just focusing on consistency. You don't care even necessarily if it's right. You just care about, are we all talking about the same number? Once you get that stable, then you talk about the accuracy. Well, we agree now it's 87, but is 87 right? It seems a little off. Well, we look at, oh yeah, we forgot this use case, blah, blah, blah. So we fix the accuracy. Now we're like, okay, we all agree it's 85. We agree 85 is correct. Do we really care about 85? Right? Do we care about truancy or whatever this metric is? Right? But you have an accurate way of determining that that's consistent, and now you can sort of say, well, is this aligned or not? And maybe it's aligned and you're great, you're good. Maybe it's not aligned, and then you have to sort of determine how you want to change it. Right? You can change it by either changing the metric, saying, oh yeah, we're a little bit off with the way we did this metric, so this new business rule came on last year, or hey, this metric's useless, let's just scrap it and change another one. Or frankly, maybe the business goal you're trying to drive to is not the right business goal, but it's not a appropriate business goal. Maybe the measurement we're trying to make to get to that business goal is just we can't do it right now. So you know what? Let's put that aside and let's do what we can. So it's not consistency. And actually, and the other thing too is, so reporting deals with data. Analysis deals with turning that data into information. And then business says that information turns into knowledge. That knowledge was a little bit of a weak mark, I think a better one. But the idea being is that there's this evolution of the sophistication of your data. And so the first thing is consistency. So what is the value measure of this metric? Meaning, what is the number that this metric is today? Is it at 87? Is it 85? Is it at 90? It's driven by reporting, right? This is reporting's job to get that number consistent as possible. And it means, like, again, what I said, just that. The metric is the same value no matter where you're reporting. Whether you're looking at that front-end dashboard, or whether you're looking at it in the system, or whatever. And so the factors that go into this is traceability. So if you have this same metric truancy in different reports, you got to make sure that you understand and document how you get to that truancy, right? So hopefully it's all kind of documented to the same source. Because before, what was happening is we had, our data, every query was implementing a truancy calculation, right? So there was no traceability because everyone was doing their own thing. And then the same parameters is a key factor too, because you could be saying, give me the number of absences, right? And thinking to yourself, well, I'm not doing the number of absences, that's just a thing. But there's different kinds of absences. Are you talking about unexcused absences? Are you talking about unexcused absences? Are you talking about truancy unexcused absences? Because there's rules where if a kid is too young, he's unexcused absence, that doesn't count towards truancy. If a kid is too old, if he's 18, it also doesn't count towards truancy. So what do you really mean? And then time factor. Well, we pulled the data on October 12th, and we got 100 absences. We pulled it again on the 19th, we got 95 for the same week. But what happened? They just corrected some data, right? That doesn't mean it's wrong. 100 was right at the time, but now 95 is right, right? So that's not necessarily a data quality issue. And then suspensions, and then pull it again later next week. And again, it's different. It's 90 that week as well. And why is that? Well, because what happens at DCPS, I'm not sure if it does at other schools, but you enter in unexcused absences first because the teacher says, I don't know if this kid is not here. I'm just going to enter unexcused absence. And then later on, they're like, oh, well, that kid was suspended. And so those absences get changed into suspension absences. But for a time, the kid looks like he's headed towards truancy, and really, he was told not to come to school. Next thing, accuracy. So you're changing data into information. Is the value that I have for this metric, is it even correct? And so, again, once you have consistency, every time on the same number, then you can sort of figure out if that number is right. And it could be accurate for various things. I'm not going to go into this too much detail, but stuff that's kind of obvious, right? You made something wrong in your algorithm, in the way you coded something. The rules you thought you were using were different than they ought to be, or those data quality issues we talked about. And finally, relevancy. So you're turning that information now into knowledge. So is this metric helping us to meet our goal? Driven by the business. So once you have accuracy, once you have consistency, you got the same number, and it's accurate, now you say, do we care about this number or just something different? If it's not, then again, like I said, you can change a metric, use a different one, refine the business rules, but you change the business goal. Because the last thing is the real key. The tail could be wagging the dog. You could have your metrics be driving which business goals you're using, but frankly, pragmatically speaking, if you have an unmeasurable goal, it's not really a goal, right? It's just a wish. And then, and this cycle is really kind of repetitive, right? So you start off with one single metric. You're like, oh, wait a minute, that's not quite the metric we want. We need to have these two different ones, and then those go bigger and bigger. And so there's this sort of cycle that you go through over and over again. But each time you're going through the consistency, accuracy, relevancy thing, so that every time you come up with some new metric or new business, you're following the same process you can apply the data. And different metrics would be at different points in the cycle. So reporting platform. So this again, like I said before, we used to use our student information system, the transactional system, as our everything. It was either reporting, and then we got some data, we threw it in there. It was just the only thing we had. So this is an example of how we find residency verification. So in DC, in order to go to DC, the law says you have to bring in this verification document that says you're a resident, right? This is how we got the simple yes/no on the residency verified or not. This whole complicated thing because we have to pull it from the transactional system. It's a huge pain in the neck. And more to the point, you try to point an analyst to that, like, I don't know what the hell that even says. And so what we did is we created this reporting platform, which really is nothing more than a database that's dedicated to reporting. So we could do whatever we wanted to, right? We could create, there was no real issue with space or speed because it was batch processing, right? So you could do some very complicated second order measurements and store those in there directly so you don't have to do the query. Complete flexibility to organize the data. So, you said, well, this piece of data is good to have in a big column, so our data is good to have in a row. It's the same data for different uses. You can organize it the way you want it. And then it was our central, like I said, data warehouse light. Whenever we had new data, instead of trying to fit it into the transactional model for the SIS, we could dump it into this reporting platform. And, oh, by the way, if there wasn't a model there, we just create a table for it. And so, again, I'm not going to go through all these, but essentially, simplicity, right? Made things a lot more easy because you could set that reporting platform to support reporting directly and only reporting, and not necessarily the transactional system. So we went from this to figure out residency to this. Well, an analyst could use that, right? You don't have to be a real SQL jockey to say, okay, let me get the residency verification, right? It was very quick and very easy. And this is a simple example. Imagine a more complicated example. So our reporting team, we really increased our efficiency. Again, consistency, right? So before, every query, if you're doing truancy, every query that was reporting on truancy had its own calculation for truancy, and hopefully it was correct. And God help you if your truancy definition changed. Then you have to go change in every little query that you did. Right now, we calculate truancy once, and now you use it for every time. And if that value changes, not only can you change it in the database, but let's have two calculations for query. The old one for truancy, the old one and the new one. So you can compare your old data still. Because there's some business rules, right? So not really, actually, that's the truancy thing. So you can calculate everything in one place, and then that traceability is saying, here is our DCPS truancy value for this kid, no matter where it's going. So go from pretty old days.
Nice.
I don't know if that was the best one for the cat. I was like, it's a lion, but you can deal with him a little bit easier when he sleeps middle of the forest. But this is sort of the architecture. So you have all these different data sources, right? Some of them were adding data all the time. Some of them are kind of a one-time load, but you have all that sea of data, and you ETL it, so extraction, transformation, load. Essentially, you're processing it. You load to the reporting platform. And then you put from the reporting platform, I'll go to this thing a little bit later, you can go into data mart for the end users to use. The point being is, yeah, direct SQL that you're managing this reporting platform. And that ETL, again, can have a lot more, 10 minutes? Okay. The ETL can have a lot more complicated process if you're doing it in one place. So, again, I'm not going to go through this, but this is the calculating truancy, essentially. So we had a attendance table, that attendance weekly I showed you before, that's now a table. So I'm doing a calculation, we're just doing a straight query. Another example is enrollment. Enrollment in the SIS is always stored as admit, withdrawal. Now we always want to balance the admits with withdrawals, so now we just balance them this way once. Now we can just use that row just as it is. Okay, very understandable for an analyst too. Assessments, this is what I was talking about. You have the same assessment data, but when you want to look at student to student, it's easier to do it with rows. When you want to compare the Q1 assessment to the Q2 assessment, it's easier to do it's easier to do with columns for a student. It's easier to do it with rows when you want to compare one assessment to the other. So again, same exact data, but in two different versions, two different tables, depending on how you want to use it. And the question was, how do we develop it? So the biggest one, we had these standardized reports. Instead of trying to say, let's make this thing perfect, start with the report, with the data that's going to the standardized reports first, prioritize that, and make sure that's perfect. And then after that, we can sort of move to less prioritized things. And the other thing is, how do you, how do you ensure that this core system you're making all your calculations in is correct? It's not adding errors itself. And the way you do that is by only dealing with good data. And I'll show you what I mean by that, because I think this is a pretty key concept. So I'm going to actually use a picture. So the idea is that you have this standard report, right? The top one. The sample report you generate from a reporting platform. Compare the two. If you notice, you're great, everything's perfect. Inevitably, you have discrepancies. The question is, well, why? Well, if the errors are because you screwed up something, you made some bug in the report, fix it, right? Or you made some bug in the ETL or whatever, you fix the reporting platform. But a lot of times the errors because you have some jacked data, some data quality problems, right? And you don't want this data quality to mess up the reporting platform because the reporting platform didn't do anything else. It made the right calculation, but your data is screwed up, and so it's screwing up the results. Because maybe the standard report is written, designed in a different way than the sample report you created. And if the data quality was perfect, then those two would be the same. But data quality being different means they're inconsistent results. And so what you do is you say, all right, this problem that we discovered here, this is what you do because you have crappy data. Let's just segregate that student, right? That's a bad word to use, but let's move that data into a different table, right? So the next run we do of this report, we're going to ignore these bad data students. We're only going to use the good data, right? So now you're focusing on your good data quality to evaluate the system. So your bad data quality you're ignoring. You're not going to ignore that when you do the report for delivery to the user, but for purposes of making the reporting platform, you're only going to look at good data for that. And so the other thing was capacity. So again, I'm not going to go through this. This is one of the surveys. And I'll have this PowerPoint available if you want to look at it. So capacity versus demand. Everyone's asking you a bunch of questions. So how do you manage that? So really, let's take this. So we had this data request tool. Really just an online request thing. And the nice thing about this is when you're communicating back and forth, hey, what do you mean with this? What do you mean with that? You're doing it in one system as opposed to email. So all the back and forth is tracked against the request. As well as when you're writing notes to your report, you're saying, oh yeah, by the way, this is what you mean by this. You have those notes in there. So everything is tracked in one place. And so another thing too is from an organization standpoint, we have what's called a data librarian who's like a dedicated person whose only job it is to talk to end users about the requests they're making, right? And so what they were doing is they clarify the request requirements, right? So program needs data. Is there a standard report available? No. So we enter a data request. The data librarian works with that user, right? They swim in that data all the time saying, what are you really asking for? When you're asking for a number of absences, do you mean ISA? Do you mean unexcused? Do you mean truancy? So you get all that straight before it goes to the report writer. Or maybe, because we store the reports in that system too, hey, you know what? We just got a request asking for the same data for every school. You're just asking for this one. Somebody just take that one section out and send it to you instead of going to the report writer. So you're really kind of using the report writers only for what you really need them for. And that's the real true kind of mecca that we want to get to, self-serve reporting. So the report writers don't do anything. The user's just doing everything on their own, right? So the goal, the goal is to kind of give, like I said, data analysts are not technologists. The goal is how do you give them enough data that they can kind of digest it. It's not overwhelming. If we just open up the reporting platform and say, hey, here you go, I got no issue with doing that, because read-only is read-only, they're not going to mess anything up. There's so many different tables, right? They're going to get overwhelmed, and they're never going to use it, right? So the question is, how do we give them something that they understand without spending the next year teaching about SQL and all that? You know, how do we go from crawling to toddling, I guess, to running to flying, right? I think you're going to like this next one. The answer is, well, you kind of don't, right? It's kind of sort of fly, right? And the way we did that was saying, all right, we're already sending you these standard reports, right? There's an HGR report, there's another one, the enrollment daily, attendance weekly, blah, blah, blah. You kind of are used to looking at it that way. So let's just use that, right? Let's not try to reinvent the wheel. Let's not try to create a brand new, like, data mart, data warehouse, blah, blah, blah. You are already looking at this format, this report in this format. Let's just get a database, right? So instead of Excel columns, you have database columns, right? So let's say, I'll show you a picture. So let's look at the enrollment daily, right? So you create that enrollment daily report. It already goes to the analyst already every day. Once a week, once a week you save that report, not as an Excel file, but as an actual table, right? And so now every row that was in that Excel file is a reportable row in the database as well. And so it has the advantage of now you can make SQL queries to compare one row to the other, to make trend analysis, stick Tableau in front of it, which you just did, direct SQL, whatever. But what you were in VLOOKUP hell, now you have a nice database view of that same data. And by the way, it's a real database, right? So it's more power, you can do more correlation, blah, blah, blah. And it's in the exact format you're already used to seeing, right? So it's a very digestible way of doing it. And so this is the enrollment one. We had one for attendance weekly, for ACGR, and only the enrollment people are looking at this one. Only attendance people are looking at attendance ones. And if we need to, we can it's still in the database, right? So we can join it to other reporting tables, right? In the reporting platform if you want to enhance that data. If like in an enrollment, let's say it's in there, the special ed thing, special ed status usually. Let's say that wasn't in there. You can easily add that in there because it's a database, right? That's the key. You're taking that Excel report and your database file. And so this is kind of the result of that. So this is not that we're doing less work. We're doing more important work, right? So the first year, this is from 12, 13, all the way down to 15, 16. It goes, further in time, or further back in time, goes up to the chart. So the first year we had a whole bunch of class, second year less, third year less. Here we are today, 15, 16, with this last row. So now what we're handling in the data in the report writers, we're only doing the stuff that you need a report writer for, right? They're not doing, hey, how many kids are at, Aton Elementary, right? There's a self-service way of doing that. They're not saying, hey, what's the absence rate for this kid? There's a self-service way of doing that, right? You're really focusing the report writer on the stuff that only they can do. So summary. Consistency, accuracy, relevancy. School staff is our data entry team, not our users. And you got to meet your data where it is today, and then build it to where you want to get to go. Right? You can't sort of say, we're going to revolutionize everything. We're going to put all this technology in place. You got to say, well, where are we today, pragmatically, realistically, from a capacity standpoint, from a sophistication standpoint, and from a budget standpoint. And there are answers to all those problems within those parameters. So they can code this thing instead of fly. Maybe you have jet power coders, they can get higher and higher. All right, so I'll leave some time for some questions. Again, data effectiveness is hopefully my new thing. Hopefully a year from now I'm using that same thing and not like working at McDonald's or something. And then data effectively is my Twitter handle, I guess the kids call it these days. And then I have a blog. So yeah, I took full-fledged into this whole social media thing because I had none of that like a month ago. But any questions? Yeah.
So, having dealt with all of these problems, there's this one little other side to that, state reporting.
Yep.
I don't have a choice for quality and accuracy, and just it's kind of like this concept of being as accurate as you can.
Yep.
For most of the state reporting, I can't, so it's kind of back at the beginning. I thought, I've got to get accurate now.
I hear you, but my response to that would be, you kind of don't have a choice, right? Because like you said, right, the data is what it is today, and so if you sort of try to do the accuracy all at once, you need to start with you need to baby step it a little bit, right? And to be honest, at DCPS, we're a little bit of an advantage with that because we're kind of a state, but we're kind of a not to, much more closer relationship with the state than other education agencies. So I don't know how much they come up, they kind of hammer down on you guys. But one could argue that if you're going to get it wrong 3 years in a row, or let's even say 10 years in a row, one where you're getting it wrong is probably not going to kill you as long as you get it right that 12th year. I hate to be dismissive like that, but it's sort of the reality of what you have to deal with. And I don't know, I wouldn't necessarily state that to your accountability authorities, like, oh, don't worry about it. Well, I was wrong. It's going to be wrong again, right? Hey, deal with it, right? But kind of internally, that might be the attitude that might be helpful to take. What's that? Or to the auditor, yeah. And so by no means am I saying this is an argument to me, right? But what I would argue is that this is an approach to take that might kind of get you a little more realistically to where you want. Any other questions? Okay. Well, thank you very much. And like I said, if you need any help, have some business cards and whatnot, so feel free to let me know.